Is this some kind of joke? The prosecutor's voice, sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the quiet hum of the courtroom. Contempt of court and now stolen valor. Sir, do you have any idea the trouble you are in? Larry Clark, 82 years of age, stood before the imposing oak bench, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He did not flinch. His gaze was steady, fixed on a point just beyond the judge, a quiet dignity enveloping him like a well-worn coat. The prosecutor, a young man in a suit that cost more than Larry's monthly income, smirked at the bailiff. Let the record show the defendant is unresponsive. The air in the courtroom was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and cheap disinfectant. It was a place of judgment, and Larry Clark was being judged harshly. The initial charge, a minor traffic violation that had been escalated due to a misunderstanding, had somehow spiraled into this public humiliation. The prosecutor, a man named Henderson, seemed to take a personal interest in dismantling the old man's character. He paced before the judge's bench, his polished shoes clicking in arrogant rhythm on the linoleum floor. "Your Honor," Henderson began, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have here a man, Mr. Larry Clark, who not only shows a flagrant disregard for the laws of this state, but also seeks to appropriate the honor of our nation's heroes." Larry remained silent. He had learned long ago that some storms were best weathered in stillness. His silence, however, only seemed to fuel Henderson's theatricality. The prosecutor gestured toward Larry's worn denim jacket. Pinned to the lapel was a small, tarnished piece of metal, a pin that looked like it had been through a lifetime of wear and tear. He presents himself in this courtroom wearing what appears to be a military decoration. A decoration, I might add, that our preliminary checks show he has no right to wear. This isn't just an insult to the court. It is an insult to every man and woman who has ever served this country with honor. The judge, a man named Davies with a perpetually weary expression, peered down from his elevated position. He saw an old man, frail and unassuming, and a prosecutor eager to make a name for himself. The path of least resistance was clear. "Mr. Clark," Judge Davies said, his voice gravelly, "do you have anything to say for yourself? Do you have documentation, any proof of service that would grant you the right to wear that insignia?" Larry's eyes, the color of a faded sky, finally shifted to meet the judge's. "It was given to me," he said, his voice soft but clear, carrying a weight that seemed to surprise the room. Henderson let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Given to you? Your Honor, this is precisely the kind of vague, nonsensical story these impostors rely on. They count on our deference to age, on our respect for the uniform, to get away with their charades. I ask that the defendant produce his DD 214. If he is a veteran, he will have it. If not, then we must conclude he is committing a federal offense." A murmur went through the small crowd in the gallery. The accusation of stolen valor was a serious one, a stain that was hard to wash away. The bailiff, a burly man with a thick mustache, took a step closer to Larry, his hand resting on his belt. The atmosphere was thick with accusation, the presumption of guilt hanging heavy in the air. Larry simply shook his head slowly. "I don't carry it with me." "How convenient," Henderson sneered. He walked over to the defendant's table and leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still audible to the first few rows. "Old man, you are in a world of trouble. People go to prison for this. You are disrespecting men who bled for this country. Men who died. And for what? So you can get a free coffee at the diner. So you can feel important for a day?" Every word was a small, sharp jab. Larry's posture remained unchanged, but a flicker of something ancient and weary passed through his eyes. He wasn't looking at the prosecutor, or the judge, or the stern-faced bailiff. He was looking at the pin on his own jacket, the small, almost insignificant piece of metal that had become the focal point of his public shaming. The polished surfaces of the courtroom seemed to dissolve, the sharp angles softening into something else entirely. The glint of the metal wasn't from the fluorescent lights overhead. It was the blinding flash of a tropical sun, reflecting off the muddy water of a rice paddy. The air was no longer stale with disinfectant, but thick with the smell of wet earth, cordite, and fear. The clicking of Henderson's shoes became the rhythmic, terrifying chatter of automatic rifle fire. The judge's bench warped into the steep, vine-choked side of a hill, a place he had once called Hill 742. He could feel the weight of his pack, the familiar heft of his rifle, the camaraderie and the terror that were two sides of the same coin. He saw the face of a young man, barely 19, pressing a piece of metal into his hand, a frantic gesture of gratitude and desperation in the heart of chaos. "You take it, Sarge," the boy had said, his voice trembling. "You got us through." The memory was so vivid, so all-consuming, that for a fraction of a second, Larry was back there, a young man again, fighting for his life and the lives of the men beside him. The courtroom was a distant, muffled dream, and the reality was the jungle, the heat, and the weight of the promise he had made. Then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The harsh lights of the courtroom snapped back into focus. The prosecutor was still talking, his face contorted in a mask of self-righteous indignation. The memory, a sacred and painful piece of his soul, was now just a tarnished pin, an object of scorn. In the back of the courtroom, a young woman sat watching the proceedings with a growing sense of unease. She was a law student, there to observe the mundane churn of the local justice system. But this was anything but mundane. There was something in the old man's eyes, a profound stillness that didn't fit the picture the prosecutor was painting. It wasn't the look of a liar or a fraud. It was the look of a man who had seen things she could never imagine. She had noticed the pin on his lapel the moment he walked in. It was small and easy to miss, but she recognized it. Her grandfather, a veteran of the same era, had one just like it, locked away in a rosewood box with his most treasured possessions. He had told her what it was, and the gravity of what it represented, as Henderson continued his tirade, demanding that Larry be held in contempt and investigated for fraud. The young woman felt a surge of adrenaline. This was wrong, terribly wrong. She looked at the judge, hoping to see a glimmer of doubt, of judicious caution, but saw only impatience. She looked at the faces in the gallery and saw only passive curiosity. No one else seemed to understand the potential gravity of the mistake being made. Slipping out of her seat, she moved as quietly as she could, her heart pounding against her ribs. She navigated the narrow aisle and pushed through the heavy courtroom doors, the prosecutor's voice fading behind her. In the echoing quiet of the marble hallway, she fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. She found the number she was looking for, a number she had been given by her grandfather years ago with the instruction, "You only call this if you see an injustice that no one else will fix." She pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang twice before a gruff, no-nonsense voice answered. "Yes? Hello, sir," she began, her voice a hushed, urgent whisper. "My name is Sarah Jensen. My grandfather is Colonel Robert Jensen. He told me to call this number if I ever needed to report something." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What is it, Miss Jensen?" "I'm at the county courthouse," she said, speaking quickly. "There's a man here, an elderly man. His name is Larry Clark. They're accusing him of stolen valor. He's wearing a pin, sir, a small silver pin with a star in the center. The prosecutor is trying to have him arrested." She took a deep breath. "Sir, I think they are making a terrible mistake." The voice on the other end of the line changed, the gruffness replaced by a sudden, sharp intensity. "What was the name you said?" "Clark. Larry Clark." There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by a muffled sound, as if the man on the other end was covering the receiver and shouting an order. "Keep them there," the voice commanded, returning to the phone. "Do whatever you have to do, but do not let them take that man out of the courtroom. We are on our way." The line went dead. Sarah stood in the empty hallway, the silence of the courthouse a stark contrast to the storm that was about to break. She had done what she could. Now she could only hope that help would arrive in time. Inside the courtroom, Henderson was moving in for the kill, convinced of his imminent victory. The wheels of a different kind of justice were already in motion, racing toward the unsuspecting courthouse with a speed and authority that would soon turn this entire proceeding on its head. The audience, the judge, and the arrogant young prosecutor had no idea what was coming. They had no idea who Larry Clark really was. Back inside the courtroom, the air was thick with impending judgment. Henderson, flushed with the certainty of his position, saw the proceedings as a mere formality. He was painting a picture for the judge, a portrait of a pathetic old man so desperate for a scrap of respect that he would steal the valor of true heroes. The narrative was simple, compelling, and in the absence of any defense, utterly damning. He requested that the judge not only find Mr. Clark in contempt but also bind him over for federal investigation under the Stolen Valor Act. It was a move designed for maximum humiliation, to make an example of this quiet, unassuming man. Judge Davies, seeing a quick and easy resolution to his crowded docket, was inclined to agree. The phone call, however, had landed like a lit match in a powder keg. Miles away, in a building of glass and steel, a two-star general had just slammed down his phone. The name Larry Clark had been spoken, and the effect was electric. An aide, a young captain, rushed into the office, his face a mask of concern. "Sir?" The general was already on his feet, his face grim. "Get me the commandant of the state police on the line. Now, and scramble a full honor guard. I want them at the county courthouse in 20 minutes. The captain, stunned by the unprecedented order, simply stammered, "Yes, sir." "Which county, sir?" The general's eyes were like chips of ice. "There is only one courthouse that matters right now, son. Find it." He began to pace his office, the quiet carpeted room suddenly feeling like a command bunker in the heart of a crisis. The name Larry Clark was not just a name. It was a legend, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and reverence in the halls of the Pentagon, a name associated with a level of bravery that few could comprehend. The idea that the man bearing that name was standing in a county courtroom, being accused of being a fraud, was not just an injustice, it was a sacrilege. Henderson, oblivious to the storm gathering outside, pressed his advantage. "Your Honor, let's be done with this charade. This man is an affront to the dignity of this court and to the memory of our fallen. I ask for immediate remand. Let him sit in a cell and contemplate the disrespect he has shown." Judge Davies nodded slowly, lifting his gavel. "Mr. Clark, you have been given ample opportunity to present evidence, to defend yourself against these very serious allegations. You have chosen not to. Therefore, I find you in contempt of this court." He was about to bring the gavel down to seal Larry's fate when the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. The sound echoed like a gunshot, causing everyone, including the judge, to turn and stare. Framed in the doorway were two state troopers, their uniforms immaculate, their faces set and serious. They were followed by a procession that silenced the entire room. A full military honor guard, 12 soldiers in their dress blues, marched into the courtroom with a precision that was both beautiful and intimidating. Their boots struck the linoleum floor in perfect unison, a rhythmic, powerful sound that completely overwhelmed the quiet proceedings. They formed two lines, creating a pathway from the door to the defendant's table. At the end of this procession, a man with 2 silver stars on his shoulders strode into the room, his presence radiating an authority that dwarfed everyone, including the judge on his bench. Major General Marcus Thorne did not look at the judge. He did not look at the prosecutor. His eyes were fixed on one person and one person only, the old man in the worn denim jacket. The entire courtroom was frozen in a state of stunned disbelief. Henderson's mouth hung open, his face a comical picture of confusion. Judge Davies had lowered his gavel, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning apprehension. The general came to a halt directly in front of Larry Clark. For a moment the two men simply looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them that no one else in the room could decipher. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the gallery, General Thorne snapped to attention, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute, his voice ringing with a power and respect that filled every corner of the room. "Sergeant Major Clark," he boomed. "It is an honor, sir." The 12 members of the honor guard followed their commander's lead, their salutes executed in a single flawless motion. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the lights overhead. Henderson looked as though he had been struck by lightning. Judge Davies seemed to shrink behind his bench. The title, Sergeant Major, had been spoken with a reverence that was unmistakable, but it was what came next that truly shattered the prosecutor's world. General Thorne, still holding his salute, turned his head slightly to address the stunned judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cold and hard as steel, "you have before you a man who has been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Bronze Star for Valor, and 4 Purple Hearts." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. This man, Sergeant Major Larry Clark, is a living legend. He single-handedly held off an enemy battalion on Hill 742 for 17 hours, saving his entire company from being overrun. The pin he is wearing on his jacket. The general continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper yet carrying an intensity that was almost frightening, is not just some trinket. It is the Silver Star, the one he was awarded for his actions on that hill. He doesn't carry his paperwork because he has never in his entire life felt the need to prove his courage to anyone. The crowd in the gallery erupted in a collective gasp. People began to stand, craning their necks to get a better look at the unassuming old man who was suddenly revealed to be a giant. The young law student, Sarah, felt tears welling in her eyes. The vindication was so swift, so absolute, it was almost overwhelming. General Thorne finally lowered his salute and turned to face the prosecutor, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You dared to accuse this man of stolen valor. You, who have never known a moment of true sacrifice, who have never had to watch your brothers fall beside you. You are a disgrace to your office and to this nation." He took a step toward Henderson, who involuntarily recoiled. "I will be speaking with the governor and the State Bar Association about your conduct here today. You have brought shame upon this courthouse." Thorne then turned back to Larry, his expression softening. "Sergeant Major, I apologize for this circus. We came as soon as we heard. Larry offered a small, tired smile. It's all right, Marcus. They didn't know. His voice was calm, devoid of any anger or resentment. He looked at Henderson, who was now pale and trembling, and then at Judge Davies, who looked utterly mortified. It's easy to judge a book by its cover, Larry said, his voice carrying a gentle wisdom. Sometimes you have to read the pages to understand the story. His gaze then drifted back to the small silver pin on his jacket. The courtroom, the general, the soldiers, they all faded away once more. He was back in the jungle, the chaos of battle raging around him. He saw again the young medic, a boy named Miller, who had been hit while trying to drag a wounded soldier to safety. Larry had crawled through a hail of gunfire to reach him, shielding the boy with his own body while he applied a tourniquet to the boy's leg. As they lay there pinned down, the medic had pressed the silver star into Larry's hand. They gave it to me for pulling a guy out of a burning APC last month, Miller had whispered, his voice weak. I don't deserve it. Not like you. He had died minutes later. Larry had kept the medal, not as a trophy of his own valor, but as a reminder of the boy's courage, a promise to a fallen comrade to live a life worthy of his sacrifice. It was not his medal, but it was his story, a burden and an honor he had carried for over 50 years. The fallout from the day's events was swift and decisive. The charges against Larry Clark were dismissed with a string of profuse apologies from a humbled Judge Davies. An internal investigation was launched into the conduct of the prosecutor's office, and Henderson was suspended indefinitely. The story, however, did not end there. 2 weeks later, by order of the governor, a new mandatory training program was instituted for all state prosecutors and judges, a program focused on cultural competency and respectful engagement with military veterans. A formal public apology was issued to Larry from the state. One quiet Tuesday morning, Larry was at his favorite diner, sitting in his usual booth by the window with a cup of black coffee. The door opened and a young man in a simple polo shirt and slacks walked in, looking nervous. It was Henderson. He walked over to Larry's booth, his eyes downcast. Mr. Clark, he began, his voice barely a whisper. May I sit down? Larry simply nodded toward the empty seat opposite him. Henderson slid into the booth. For a long moment he just stared at his hands. I came to apologize, he said finally. What I did, there's no excuse. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. So deeply, terribly wrong. Larry took a slow sip of his coffee. You were doing your job as you saw it. No, Henderson said, shaking his head. I was trying to win. I didn't see a person. I saw a case. I didn't see a hero. I saw a target. I'll never forget the lesson you and General Thorne taught me that day. Larry looked at the young man, at the genuine remorse in his eyes. Everyone makes mistakes, he said quietly. The important thing is what you do after. You learn. You grow. You become a better man. He offered a small smile. That's all any of us can do. Henderson nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He stood up, extended his hand, and Larry shook it. It was a quiet moment of reconciliation, a closing of a painful chapter. As Henderson walked away, Larry was left with his coffee, the morning sun streaming through the window, a quiet hero in a world that had, for a brief shining moment, been forced to remember the true meaning of valor. If you were moved by Larry Clark's story, please like and share this video. Subscribe to Veteran Valor for more incredible stories of unassuming heroes who deserve our respect and recognition.